They'll normally come to the table with the knowledge of what these systems can look like, and obviously design aesthetic for an architect is one of the key things in terms of what they're doing. But some of the things that they may not be that familiar with on day one is, in our experience, looking at the fire rating. So the type of construction and the fire rating is very critical. And then the second thing that's critical very early on is to look at acoustics.
What if the key to delivering beautiful, high-performance mass timber buildings on budget and on schedule wasn't just in the material, but in the mindset of the engineer? Well, today's guest, Julian Lineham, is a structural engineer and founding principal of Studio NYL, and he's got over 35 years of experience across 20 mass timber projects under his belt. From complex heritage integrations in London to community centers, museums, and many more buildings across the US, Julian brings a rare level of detail, precision, and craft to mass timber work. This episode is a masterclass in how to think smarter about hybrid systems, detailing, and project execution. In it, we cover how to actually integrate mass timber into hybrid structures without sacrificing beauty, performance, or speed, the role of repetition, fire rating, and connection control in reducing risk and costs, and why engineers, architects, and contractors all benefit when the connection design stays in-house and collaboration starts early. Julian walks us through real-world lessons from projects like the North End Community Center, the Museum of Nebraska Art, and Bonnet Springs Park, showing how mass timber thrives when hybrid systems are engineered with precision, fire ratings are addressed early, and every connection is intentional. But before we dive in, the early bird pricing for the Mass Timber Group Summit is ending soon. If you're an architect, an engineer, a GC, or a developer who wants to get past the fluff and into the rooms where these smartest minds in mass timber are connecting, you need to be in Denver this August. You can use code PODCAST, all caps, at masstimber.group to save $50 on your ticket. And don't wait, because the early bird ends soon and it will sell out. So with that, let's get into it.
Thank you. Good morning or good afternoon. My name is Julian Lineham. I'm one of the two founding principals of Studio NYL, Structural Engineers and Facade Designers. I'm a structural engineer by trade. I grew up in London, England, spent the first 10 years of my career there, and then moved to the States. I've always been interested in architecture and creative design. And Studio NYL started about 21 years ago in Colorado, in Denver, Colorado. And since then, we've grown our practice nationally and internationally. So we have projects all over the country. We have projects, we've actually touched projects in every continent apart from Antarctica. So that's on my bucket list. I've been doing this quite a long time, graduated back in '86, and have a wealth of experience in all different types of structural systems and materials. And more recently, has been telling Brady I had about 20 mass timber projects, either in design or construction, over the last 10 or so years. So that's the space we're in currently.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that and unpacking. And I think, that's 20 plus projects is quite a bit, right? That gives you a lot of different iterations to learn, improve, get better on, and then take those lessons into the future projects. But before we started recording, you were talking about coming from and these are my words, like the super highly custom engineering background. And I was curious how designing like truly complex one-off projects kind of shapes the way you look at the way that we're building mass timber buildings right now.
Yeah, absolutely. So as you mentioned, I grew up in London in the late 80s in the high-tech period of architecture with Fosters and Rogers and Allsop and people like that. So the structural engineering practice I was with at the time was working with those people as clients, working on obviously brand new projects that they did, but also some of my favorite projects are where we integrate brand new pieces into historic buildings. So it's like the juxtaposition of new and old. And every single project was treated, I'll call it like bespoke engineering without sounding egomaniacal, but everything was custom. I mean, literally we drew every connection. We detailed up every piece of rebar in a project, and that's just a different level of service that happens over in the UK as opposed to the US. So yeah, I grew up with that kind of background in structural engineering and detailing, and that kind of informed my thought process on every project that I take. So when I emigrated to the States, it was a little unusual to see a different level of service, a different amount of detail that people tend to put into projects. But one thing I definitely found, not only with steel detailing, but also as we got into the mass timber space, was the necessity to really drill down into the details, understand exactly how everything gets put together, and detail it accordingly. So, yeah, that certainly informed my thinking on that.
Yeah, I can only imagine. That is outside of my world, but I imagine taking everything that's bespoke and then bringing it into like some people would say mass timber is kind of bespoke now. Certainly if you're coming from the outside, but regardless. So you took all that experience and you brought it over here, and now we're talking about mass timber. What was the first mass timber project you guys worked on here in the States?
So one of them was at Bonnet Springs Park, which is in Lakeland, Florida. The architect and landscape planner and landscape architect was Sasaki out of Boston, so they were our architectural client. This is a very large project. It was 250-acre park, which was basically being reclaimed. It was an old railroad yard and had a lot of brownfield problems, but the city wanted to reclaim that land because it adjoined a whole bunch of natural lakes, and they wanted to reactivate the whole place. So there were like 15 new buildings. There was a very large event center with like an 80-foot span that we ended up doing with glulam beams and a CLT roof. There was a nature center which had what I call traditional mass timber, glulam beams and solid sawn beams and tongue and groove. There was a welcome center, there was a children's museum, there was a cafe, there were all these service buildings. It was a massive project, but we wanted to focus today on more of the event center, and that was the first foray into mass timber for us at Studio NYL, where the client was interested because it was such a natural setting. The client was interested in wood structures wherever possible. So rather than defaulting to a traditional full steel building for the long span roof, we asked them to, or encouraged them to look at mass timber as a system that we could look at that brought the wood and the warmth and the wellness, especially to an event center where they were going to hold weddings and other celebratory events. So that project, we started with a glulam roof system. As I say, one of the tricks we use on a lot of projects is to do like a double glulam side by side, because then you reduce the overall height of the structure of the roof. And we spaced those glulams to suit the CLT roof system that we were planning on using, the span capability of that roof. And fortunately, down in Florida, unlike where I'm sitting here in Colorado, the snow loads are non-existent. So that was a benefit to that project. We had a lot less of a roof loading condition. But what we ended up with on that project was not only the event center space in the center of the building with that large 80-foot span roof, but around the perimeter we had a low-level roof that created like a colonnade around the building and also helped with shading down into the interior space. And the architect wanted to take the theme of the wood structure out to the colonnade, but have a really simple plane. So what we ended up doing on the exterior, because we already had CLT on the project, was to use CLT panels spanning between steel beams, but the steel beams were not set down below the CLT. They were an HSS system, an HSS beam with a steel bottom plate that got supported on slender steel columns, and then the CLT planks could get landed on that bottom plate and all tied together. So even though this project was very large, it was probably 15,000 square feet, all the panels were erected in 3 days.
Wow.
It was a very, very fast project. So that was another benefit, because contractors are working across this whole site, all 15 buildings, and speed was essential to them on all the projects. So the benefit of the wood look, the sustainability aspects that the client was looking for in the natural setting, and the speed of construction was what drove us towards that hybrid structure on that project.
And so that was the first project, and now you've got, over 20. What did you learn off that project that you're taking into like maybe two of your more recent projects, like the Museum of Nebraska Art or the Northern Community Center?
I think one of the first things we learned was the only way to get these systems in onto projects was to really look at the speed of construction and the detailing to try and get as much repetition as possible. So for the Bonnet Springs project, we had pretty straightforward double glue-lams and CLT roof. We had a perimeter low-level structure, all with a standard base. All the panel sizes were pretty repetitious. We took that to the North End Community Center project in St. Paul, Minnesota, that we did with Snow Krylik Architects. And that was going to be their first mass timber project. So they were interested in exploring that with us. That project had two components. One of them was a large gymnasium space, which in some ways mimicked what we'd just done at Bonnet Springs. That was about a 55 to 60 foot span gym. And we did the double glue lamp system again for the beams for the roof structure with CLT planks, again spacing the glue lamps accordingly to the 5-ply CLT span capabilities, given that we had larger snow loads up there in St. Paul. And so that space was also interesting because it was a sort of walkout condition from the entry at street level, which was halfway up the height of the gymnasium one side, to a walkout condition to the park at the perimeter on the other side of the building. And so what we couldn't do there easily was look at a full mass timber frame. So we looked at a hybrid structure where we had round steel HSS columns and steel exposed brace frames, which supported the CLT and glue lam roof. So the glue lam roof had the beam spanning across the gym, plus it also had a perimeter glue lam beam that helped support the edge of the deck. And then that was basically the gymnasium space. And then the community center space immediately adjacent to this building and connected to it with a more traditional steel and concrete on metal deck structure supporting like a plaza slab. That connected across to the community center, which was a 3-story building. One level similar to the gym that was entry at the street level, walk out at the back, and then 2 floors above that. And that building wanted to be, from the architectural vision, a full mass timber building. So CLT roof, floors, glue lam beams. There was a hope to try and do glue lam columns in that, but unfortunately, once we got the sizing of those columns, the overall footprint on the site didn't really allow us to do such large pure timber columns. So we basically iterated away from that to, again, a round steel HSS column picking up the glue lam beams. So that's more of a hybrid structure as well. That had some perimeter steel brace frames and an interior CMU elevator shaft that helped provide the lateral stability. So yeah, we took a lot of the lessons learned from Bonnet Springs into the North End Community Center project.
A lot of the conversation in the mass timber world right now is like, hey, when to use timber, how are we combining it with different structural systems, et cetera. What are you seeing specifically on the community center project with like budget versus performance versus schedule, and how are you integrating these different materials? Like, what would you advise to somebody else that's looking at a project in the same way?
Well, I think one of the key things is that even if you're driven towards the mass timber for the looks, the aesthetic, the design, and what the client wanted, the client also wanted a mass timber building. They were exploring that as the local authority. You still had to persuade it, still had to work through all those challenges that you mentioned. So the construction schedule, the mass timber was beneficial in that because it could get erected pretty quickly and try and enclose the buildings as swiftly as possible. The budget was a challenge. Budget tends to always be a challenge in terms of a premium up front. But if it's more of an institutional project where the client's going to hold the project, we think that the clients can see the long-term benefit of the buildings that, are beautiful and bring the community in. This was a very, instrumental building in trying to rebuild the community in that part of the country. I just noticed last weekend it was 5 years since the George Floyd, and this was part of the whole rebuilding the community, was to design a really welcoming community center where everybody could come in most of the hours of the day and the night, and there's a safe place. And when you're surrounded by timber, it lowers your blood stress levels or blood pressure levels and your stress levels. So, there's an element of that. You still have to challenge yourself with the upfront premium cost. And the way that we did on that project was we talked with the contractors to look at different sourcing for the panel systems, the CLT roof and floors, and we ended up with KLH panels out of Austria, mainly because the building had some slightly complex detailing in and around the round columns at the edge of the building where there was a double cantilever, and the KLH panels could be custom designed with a slightly different thickness, so you're not locked into the US and Canadian markets based on 3, 5, 7 ply, etc. So that was worth exploring, and that's something I'd encourage everybody to do early on in a project. If there's any way to get the fabricators and suppliers involved as early as possible, that's great, because then you can tailor the building more towards them, and also look at some of these things like I've mentioned where you really can truly design that. And in fact, if I can go off on a slight tangent, we had another project with Snow Acrylic, which was for Bremer Bank in Minot, North Dakota, where, again, we started with a CLT roof, and this is more of a sort of traditional glulam beam and column system, columns at about 12 feet on center, CLT roof. And we had SmartLam looking at that one, and we looked at their system, and they were proposing potentially even a 4-ply CLT, which is a little unusual, but that's because we had cantilevers in 2 directions at the corners of the roof. And we went through that, but ended up finding that we could go across more to a GLT, a glue laminated panel system, 2'6" wide, mainly because it had enough capacity to do the long cantilevers in one direction, and even with a little bit of steel angle on top to help it span the short direction, we saved so much volume of wood going back to more like a 3-ply thickness rather than a 4-ply. So it's having those early decisions. We couldn't really have changed that during CDs, so that we were lucky that happened during the design development phase. So I don't know if that answers your question, Brady, but those are the kind of things that you have to consider early on.
Yeah, it absolutely does. On the community center project, I think I heard that you say that the design firm, this was their first mass timber project. Was that correct?
Yes.
So with somebody that's got 20 of these buildings under their belt, what does it look like for the collaboration between you and the architect to say, like, hey, exceptional architects haven't really done a mass timber building yet. What are the conversations that you're having with them, and what advice are you giving them moving into their design?
Well, absolutely, because they'll normally come to the table with the knowledge of what these systems can look like, and obviously design aesthetic for an architect is one of the key things in terms of what they're doing. But some of the things that they may not be that familiar with on day one is, in our experience, looking at the fire rating. So the type of construction and the fire rating is very critical. And then the second thing that's critical very early on is to look at acoustics. So when you're looking at like a CLT floor system, what we ended up with on the community center was us helping direct them to some of the good knowledge available through Woodworks and all the different systems that they have cataloged. We ended up with a 5-ply CLT plank with an Acoustomat, and then a 2.5-inch normal weight concrete topping on that project. So it was truly understanding, all the different systems you could look at very early on to make sure you've got the sound ratings you're looking for, and that builds into obviously the floor build up and the overall building section in terms of the architect understanding how deep the structure is going to be. In the community center, we could space the columns. There were a lot of rooms in that building that allowed us to have a slightly tighter column spacing than we would have had if we'd gone with more of a steel structure. That was the benefit, was being able to keep the glulam beams to a certain depth that didn't increase the overall building height. So, understanding all those systems and being able to dive into, giving good sectional information to an architect very early, very early on in the process is key.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And we're talking the projects so far are very like community centric building, right? The bank may be private, but still a very public space.
Yeah.
What are some of the key considerations that you guys look at and that you direct your architect partners to look at when you're talking from going from like these community spaces to maybe more commercial or residential?
Well, we've done a few proposals for residential projects. In fact, the one we were chatting about before we started recording was a project that we proposed and got through permitting in Boston, which was a 5-story residential apartment building where we were using CLT on the roof and the floors and CLT bearing and shear walls. And this was at the time several years ago before CLT was recognized under the SPIDWIS design guides as a system that could take shear wall loads or floor diaphragm loads. So at the time, most buildings, and in fact, if we go back to the Bonnet Springs project, the roof of the CLT was not allowed to act as the diaphragm, so we had a roof sheathing above that. Similarly, on this Boston project, we had roof sheathing, as roof and floor sheathing doing the diaphragms, but we did go in under a variance to the building code to get the shear walls to be adopted. So that project was laid out beautifully because, as you're probably familiar with all these different residential or university dormitory projects, the room spacing allows for either a very tight column grid, or as was the case in the Boston project, because we were using CLT as bearing walls, we had very closely spaced demising walls as bearing walls. So that allowed us to end up using 3-ply systems in most of the building. So that's just different things to consider, as you say, depending on the type of project. And quite honestly, we have done more community-based projects, typically in the mass timber.
And so those 2 or 3 projects that we just talked about, again, if we're doing things right, we're always rolling the lessons learned into the next project, et cetera. So one of the reasons that we kind of connected to do this podcast was the Museum of Nebraska Art project. So let's talk about that one a little bit. Tell me what that project is, and then maybe some of like the key challenges that you guys overcame kind of based on your past experience.
Absolutely. So the timelines of all these projects we've been talking about are interesting because they all sort of started in and around COVID. Some went on, and the North End Community Center went on hold almost for like 2.5 years, and then it came back. And so all these project timelines are kind of overlapping. So we're learning from each project even during design. The Museum of Nebraska Art project with BVH Architecture was a project we were brought into for our mass timber experience. So it's in Kearney, Nebraska, right in the middle of the state, just off I-80. The existing museum was in a 1911 old post office building, like a classic-looking Carnegie Library, Georgian columns, etc. And the goal of the museum was to expand because they didn't have enough space to show a lot of their collections. So the project involved the historic renovation of that 1911 building, which was fascinating. Given my history, I love projects of that kind of age and that type of construction. And then to add on a new addition to the north of the project that the architect conceived as a mass timber building, full mass timber building. So CLT roof, floors, glulam beams and girders, and glulam columns. And that was originally conceived as a two-story addition above a basement, where the basement would be an interesting space where the public can go down into the basement and see some of the art that is stored on racks, and some of it is in display in storage. And then the upper spaces are public galleries, and then more of a private gallery on the top level of the building. And given the driving aesthetic for the desire to use mass timber, again, we had the system where in some of the larger span spaces, we'd try to use a double glulam to keep the depth of the structure down. The actual building volume was fascinating because it did cantilever in some places to the extent where we had some 56-inch deep glue lamps. We had like 12-foot cantilevers where the building massing overhung where the building entry was. So that allowed mechanical to be distributed quite nicely within a 56-inch depth. So, but again, the driving force was the aesthetics, trying to do the project in mass timber. And when you see the finished photos, the beautiful thing about the mass timber really plays off against the wood flooring and then all the white walls of the gallery. So it's a fantastic aesthetic. And the grand opening was just a couple of months ago, and the client is amazed at the space. Obviously, they can now display a lot more of their art and bring the whole community into that building as well. So some of the lessons we learned on that one was moisture management during construction, because that was going up during the winter. So we were helping advise the contractors and the subcontractors of the timber framing. We're advising the contractor to try and keep water off the system, keep snow off the system, et cetera, et cetera. So moisture management was fairly critical on that. The other thing that was interesting on that project is we actually had some intumescent paint connections. Some of the steel brace frames, we couldn't get the brace frames to work with timber columns, so we had some steel columns integrated with steel brace frames into the glue lamp beam. So there were some interesting connections there, some of which needed to be fire protected. So the interface of intumescent paint and the sequencing of that with the glue lamps was quite interesting, something none of us had done before. So we learned some good lessons on that one. And then again, as always, it's the detailing of the connections, trying to minimize the look of the steel bearing angles, because wood likes to bear rather than be bolted. So wherever possible, you bear the wood beams on steel angles and kerf plates and things. So there were some good lessons learned there in terms of the geometry.
Yeah. Well, these projects are beautiful, and I know we're going to throw some of the images of them up on the screen. So after these three projects specifically, but then everything that you guys have been doing, what would you say is kind of like one of the most overlooked common pitfalls from any member of the design build team that you think is like an area of focus that we should be looking at?
I think one of them is, as much as the pricing of the mass timber is based on volumetric assessments of like the area of the glue lamp, etc. As I mentioned earlier, if you go back to the fire rating, the fire rating really drives you to minimum sizes. If you go to the traditional type 4HT, which is very prescriptive, or if you start going to different types of construction where you can, I'll call it fire engineer it, but it's more in terms of getting the amount of wood cover over the steel connections. Intuitively, engineers tend to want to minimize the amount of wood because of the cost. So you're always looking at trying to get potentially a slightly thinner beam, but a deeper beam. Now that can hurt you at the connections if you haven't considered fire early enough. So counterintuitively, sometimes a wider beam that will give you all that cover without having to fire protect the connections is the better solution. Okay, it might cost a little bit more up front, but it saves you a lot of money on those connections and the ease of construction for the contractor. If you're not messing around trying to intumescent paint some steel connector pieces and columns, and the interface between those can just add a lot to the schedule, which, as we mentioned earlier, the schedule helps drive the cost down if you can get it erected very quickly. So that's kind of a big lesson learned.
Yeah, I think that ties back into like the term that everybody hears time and time again. It's like early collaboration, and some more early collaboration, right? Because it's
wherever possible.
Yeah, because you're defining these members and these connections, but then somebody else is going to go install them in the field, right? So it's like, hey, what are we talking to with on our GC? Maybe they're self-performing, or the installer specifically, and what's going to make their life easier, what's going to reduce their man-hour labors, et cetera. It's kind of
and just to touch on that or continue that thought, Something that's interesting in the engineering industry is, or how these projects are specified is, we as a consultant have always detailed out all our connections. That might have come from my background and in terms of wanting to, understand how it all works, but also make it look the way we want it to look. And if you're dealing with a steel building that's all going to get hidden, that's not too much of an issue. But if you're dealing with a mass timber project where all the connections are critical, I like to keep the connection design, or Studio ML, I like to keep the connection design in-house. So we don't specify those as a delegated design package. Now, some other people might specify it that way and they start losing a little bit of control over that connection. Or, as I say, if you have the early collaboration with some of the suppliers, you can talk to their in-house engineers and really develop a connection that around a detail, the way they'd like to do it, which makes their erection easier and faster. And that's great. Having that dialogue early is great. I just think that being in control of your connections is critical, and that helps schedule. And in fact, we've got another project that I haven't even mentioned to you yet. So we're up in Edina, Minnesota right now. Is a brand new library we're doing with MSR Design, and that schedule is driven by the fact it's going so fast that we have early bid packages, and the contractor requested that we do all the connection design because they realized that they would lose a lot of the timeline for us just specifying all the loads, subbing it out to the timber supplier's engineer, having the time for them to do the calcs, put it back to us to review, et cetera, et cetera. So there's an interesting schedule issue there in and around connections that sometimes gets lost on projects. So it's just good to be mindful of that as well.
Yeah, no, that's really good insight. And so aside from obviously hands-on practical experience, dozens and dozens of these buildings, where do you go to learn? Like, where are you going to stay up to speed and kind of stay on the leading edge?
Well, certainly Woodworks, and then a whole bunch of, podcasts like the ones you do yourself. There's some other good people through Woodworks that do podcasts. There's a lot of good technical information on Woodworks. And then there's also some sort of higher theoretical insights, like an ex-boss of mine. I don't know if you've heard of that book called Blank, which is about CLT. It's quite fascinating. I'll send you a link to that.
Yeah, please do.
What an interesting book. And that's very theoretical about, it's almost, CLT is kind of like a blank canvas. So what can you do with it? It opens up a whole bunch of opportunities, essentially. So
For sure.
So yeah, just trying to stay in front of information like that, and then just following as many details as many companies that are doing this work on LinkedIn or the social media space, just looking at, we learn that on all different types of projects, just seeing how people have got around interesting detailed challenges. So, yep.
So it's kind of like plugging in with the community, staying up to date with what's coming out, spending the time.
Attending conferences like your conference. Yeah.
Oh, thank you for that generous plug.
Of course.
Before I ask my last well, actually I have two more questions. Maybe it's a lie, but we'll start with this. If people want to learn more about you and connect with you, what's the best way to do that?
Through our website, which is www.studionyl.com, or I'm on LinkedIn. It's Julian Lineham. You should be able to find me.
Yeah, I'll link both of those down below in the show notes for everybody that's listening to link Julian LinkedIn and then the website, because you guys got some great projects up there. Highly recommend people check them out.
Thank you.
So my second to last question is, like, what are you excited about in the future of the mass timber industry? Like, what excites you? What are you guys looking for in terms of projects? Like, what would really light a fire inside of you if you got to work on?
Sure. Well, we've been very lucky. We've got, as I say, we've had exposure in a whole bunch of different project types. One thing I would absolutely love to do is a mass timber stadium of any kind of size, whether it's minor league teams or major or international stadiums. There's been some beautiful mass timber stadiums out there. We're lucky we've touched on a whole bunch of project types of Studio NYL in mass timber and other systems. So that would really excite me. That would be great. The other thing that would be interesting, and we actually had a client come in one day and brainstorm with our team, was to try and do some kind of moving structure. So this is a concept of a museum that the upper floor of the museum would rotate to track the sun. I mean, that something similar that, it's a sense of wonder, a sense of disbelief or craziness. But, that's the kind of thing that excites us, is there's something that's a little unusual. If if they're interested in tracking the sun and they're tied into the planet and nature, then that would be a perfect opportunity to do something out of mass timber that, could become some kind of cool museum. So fingers crossed that one might come back one day.
Yeah, I agree there. There's I've been in a couple different mass timber stadiums, sporting arenas, etc., and they're incredible.
Mhm.
But I think if I was to walk into a moving, spinning building that tracked the solar progression, that might be a little cooler. So I'll
Yeah.
keep my ears out for anybody looking for those types of inspiring projects. So true last question for you. If you had somebody's ear for 30 seconds, let's say maybe it's an architect or a fellow engineer, and you had to leave them with one thing about this industry, why they should pursue it, why they should invest their time, energy, and resources into learning about it, what would you say to them?
Well, I think the natural thing is it's good for the planet. I think as much as we can use sustainable resources in the best way possible, that is awesome. I think the other thing is this is an exciting, growing space. I mean, I still have links with some of my colleagues over in Europe, and it's pretty embedded in Europe. There's a lot of projects all across Europe in all different project types, and I think the North American industry is great in that we are learning from that. Plus, we're also iterating our own design ideas and tying into the systems and the supply sources here that are more appropriate. And obviously, on a lot of projects, are more appropriate because we can get the resources from closer to us. We don't have to bring in the panels like the KLH ones from Austria, which actually was surprisingly sustainable when we looked up relative to shipping down from Canada. But I think it's a growing industry. I think the more people that learn more about it, there will be more opportunities because architects and contractors can talk to their clients and developers and explain what we have learned over the last, I'll call it 20 years. And then also, what we can do with true innovation. I mean, there are some amazing things at the Mass Timber Conference in Portland, the International Mass Timber Conference. There's always suppliers that are coming up with different ways of connecting mass timber, different ways of, even different systems that are being used. So it's exciting to be sort of in an industry that really wants to iterate and innovate as well. So yeah, let's watch this space, I guess.
Yeah, that's a great answer, my friend. So thank you for spending time unpacking these projects with me and kind of sharing with me the ins and outs of hybrid, when and where. And I look forward to seeing you in Denver for the Mass Timber Group Summit this summer.
That'd be great. Thank you very much for having me. Appreciate it, Brady.